I never thought signing a consent form would be the most consequential thing I ever did with a pen. It was a standard document, at least by the unusual standards of the UN Interstellar Commission. 3 pages of dense language, 2 pages of risk disclosures, and 1 page that basically said, "We don't fully know what will happen, and you acknowledge that." I read every word. I signed on the dotted line. Then I folded my hands in my lap and waited for the veth medical team to begin. The room smelled like cold metal, and something faintly sweet, the way hospitals sometimes smell when they're trying very hard not to smell like hospitals. The walls were a pale blue-green that I later learned was the veth equivalent of calming. It didn't particularly calm me, but I appreciated the effort. Dr. Venkal stood at the equipment panel, her long, segmented fingers moving across controls with the kind of precision that comes from doing something thousands of times. She was tall, maybe 1.5 meters, built like something between a praying mantis and a paper lantern. Her eyes were compound and a deep amber color. When she looked at me, I always had the feeling she was seeing more than I was showing. "You may feel a drop in temperature," she said. Her translator rendered her voice into a clean, slightly flat English. "The syntharrhea is stored at 4 degrees below your body's baseline. The sensation should pass within minutes." I nodded. "How long does the full procedure take?" 3 hours and 12 minutes on average." "Okay," I said. "I'm going to count the ceiling tiles." She paused. Her head tilted at the small angle I had already learned meant she was uncertain about something. "Why?" "Something to do," I said. She wrote something in her notes. I didn't ask what. The procedure itself was not painful. That surprised me more than anything else about it. I had expected something dramatic, something that matched the scale of what was happening. They were draining my blood, running it through a filtration and integration system, and replacing it with a synthetic fluid laced with machines too small to see. Machines that would, theoretically, make me healthier, faster healing, more resilient. The veth had used syntharrhea across 12 species and centuries of medical history. It had a perfect safety record. What I felt instead was a slow, spreading coolness, like sliding into a pool that was just a little too cold. My fingertips went first, then my arms. Then a calm, deep chill settled in my chest, and I breathed through it and thought about home. I thought about a diner near my apartment that made very good eggs. I thought about my sister's dog. I counted ceiling tiles. There were 47 of them. When it was over, Venkal ran her initial scans and recorded her baseline data and told me I could sleep if I wanted. I wasn't tired. I told her so. She wrote something else in her notes. On the first morning after the procedure, I felt sharp. That was the only word for it. When I looked at the far wall of my quarters, I could read the serial number on a panel I hadn't been able to read before. When I moved a half-second faster than I expected to. My coffee tasted different, brighter somehow, more layered. I assumed this was what they meant by enhancement, and I felt quietly pleased about it. Then I cut my hand on the edge of a food tray, a shallow and stupid little accident, and watched the wound close in approximately 40 seconds. I stared at my palm for a long time. Then I went to find Venkal. She was not surprised by the healing rate. That was within expected parameters, she said. She did the morning biometrics efficiently and calmly, and then she looked at the results, and then she ran them again, and then she stood very still for a moment before quietly calling 2 of her colleagues into the room. I sat on the examination table and waited. The 3 veth scientists stood in a cluster, speaking in their own language, which the translator wasn't rendering because it was a private channel. I could tell from the quality of their stillness that something was wrong. Not dangerous. Just wrong, in the way that a number appearing where it has never appeared before is wrong. Venkal turned to me. "Your passive behavior index is reading 4.7, she said. "Is that bad?" "It is not bad," she said carefully. "It is impossible. The index is fixed at 0.3 across all species in our medical database. It has never read higher than 0.6 in any living subject. The syntharrhea is a passive system. It assists biological function. It does not integrate. And right now, she said, it appears to be integrating." I looked at my healed hand. "Huh," I said. She wrote in her notes for a very long time after that. What followed was 2 weeks of testing that I can only describe as thorough. The veth were extraordinarily professional about it. They explained every test before they ran it, obtained my consent for each one, and offered to stop at any point. I didn't stop anything. I was curious, and besides, I'd come a long way for this. They ran pressure tests and temperature exposure panels and oxygen reduction sequences, and a full-spectrum radiation sampling that took 3 hours. They drew blood, or what was passing for blood now, 6 times a day. They mapped my neural responses and measured my reaction times, and asked me detailed questions about how I felt, what I noticed, whether anything was painful. I told them the truth each time. I felt pretty good, actually. A little tired by the end of the day. Nothing that a night's sleep didn't fix. On day 11, a coolant line failed in the testing lab. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, just a slow leak that filled the lower part of the room with a gas that the emergency system immediately flagged as toxic. To veth respiratory systems, even a trace concentration was enough to require evacuation. The room cleared in seconds. I was at the far end of the lab when it happened, and I walked out at a normal pace, coughing twice, and stood in the corridor while the automated systems purged the room. Venkal was staring at me, with an expression I had learned to read as close to alarm as veth faces could get. "You were in there for 63 seconds, she said. "Give or take," I said. "Is everyone else all right?" She didn't answer right away. She was looking at the readout from the room sensors. The concentration was high enough to cause significant respiratory injury in any conclave species. Possibly worse. I coughed twice, I said. "Do you have water? My throat's a little dry." She got me water. She also sat down, which I had never seen her do during working hours before. The veth scientists were, by training and disposition, very composed people. They did not panic. They did not dramatize. But I began to notice, in the days that followed, a kind of tension that hadn't been there before. Conversations stopping when I entered rooms, extra staff appearing at observation sessions, messages being sent on channels the translator wasn't given access to. I was not being treated badly. I was being treated with the careful attention you give something you don't entirely understand yet, and that, in its own way, was more interesting than anything the tests had shown. Venkal told me about the syntharrhea's behavior on day 14. She sat across from me in the small office adjacent to the lab, and she explained it the way she explained everything. Precisely, with no unnecessary softening. The nanofluid, she said, was designed with a fixed behavioral architecture. In every species it had ever been used with, it maintained that architecture without variation. It performed its functions, assisted biological processes, and remained exactly what it was programmed to be. In my body, it had done something none of the conclave's engineers had thought to code a protection against, because they had never needed to. It had read my cellular biology as an instruction set. My immune system, which had spent a few 100,000 years learning to recruit, repurpose, and adapt anything it encountered, had essentially treated the syntharrhea like new staff. It had integrated it, put it to work in new configurations, and the syntharrhea, lacking any instruction to resist this, had cooperated fully. "It has rewritten portions of its own base code," she said, "using your cells as the template." I thought about this for a moment. So my body taught it new tricks. That is a simplified but not inaccurate description, yes. And this has never happened before. Not once, she said, in 12 centuries of use across 12 species. I nodded slowly. "You look tired, Doctor." She was quiet for a moment. "The conclave is frightened," she said. "Not of you specifically, of the implication." She paused again. "I want to ask you something. Are all humans like this? Biologically, I mean. Is this an anomaly within your species? Or is this typical human physiology responding to our technology?" I thought about the people I knew. Construction workers who pushed through injury because there was no one else to finish the job. Soldiers who kept going on 3 hours of sleep and called it a good night. Parents up at 2 in the morning for the 4th time, with a sick child, still functioning, still calm. Athletes who trained until their bodies found new ceilings. Ordinary people getting through extraordinary things without making any particular fuss about it. "Pretty typical," I said. She closed her notebook. It was the first time I had seen her do that without writing something first. A delegation arrived on day 16. The Keth observers, representatives of the oldest species in the conclave, were described to me as beings who had not reacted with surprise to anything in recorded memory. They were tall and very still, and communicated in a way the translator rendered as something between speech and written statement. They reviewed the data for several hours. Then one of them said, in a voice like a door closing in a very large room, "We have seeded our technology across 100 civilizations over 4 centuries. We have never had a civilization seed it back." The room was silent after that for a long time. I heard this through the monitoring feed that Vane Cal had quietly patched me into. She had not told me she was going to do it. I had not asked. I wrote the Keth Observer's statement in my personal log, and then I wrote one line beneath it, and then I closed the log and looked out the viewport at the stars and felt something that took me a moment to identify. It wasn't pride exactly. It was more like recognition, like hearing a description of someone you know and thinking, yes, that sounds right. The conclave's formal offer came 3 days later. 2 options, presented without pressure, though I was aware that a great deal rested on whichever I chose. The first option was reversal. They would remove the modified syntharrhea, restore my original biology as closely as possible, and Earth would be placed on a restricted contact list for the next 50 years. Time to prepare, they called it. Time for both sides to understand what contact would mean before committing to it. The second option was continuation. I returned to Earth as I was, with the integrated syntharrhea still functioning inside me. Veth medical teams would work directly with human researchers, and humanity would enter full open contact with the conclave, ahead of any previously discussed schedule, ahead of any gradual introduction plan, ahead of everything. I asked for 40 seconds to think. I think they expected me to ask for days. I used the 40 seconds honestly. I thought about what 50 years of restricted contact would mean. I thought about what full contact would mean, the complications, the negotiations, the long and probably difficult work of 2 civilizations learning to deal with each other at close range. I thought about Venkal writing in her notebook, and the Keth Observer going quiet for the first time in centuries, and the coolant gas that I had walked through without quite noticing. Then I asked Venkal one question. "Will your people be honest with mine?" She considered this. "I cannot speak for the conclave," she said. "I can only speak for myself and my team." "That's enough of an answer," I said. I chose the second option. Then I asked if there was any chance of getting decent coffee on the shuttle home, because the veth version tasted like warm pencil shavings, and I had been polite about it for 3 weeks. Before I boarded, Vane Cal stopped me in the corridor. She had something she wanted to ask, she said, a question she'd been holding for some time. I told her to go ahead. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "At any point during the procedure, during the tests, the coolant exposure, the conclave sessions, any of it?" She had her notebook open. The question was genuine. A scientific inquiry from someone who had studied fear responses in living organisms for decades and still found them worth investigating. "Were you ever actually afraid?" I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "Sure," I said. "I was nervous before the procedure. I didn't like the sound of the coolant alarm. The conclave session where they discussed quarantining humanity for 50 years was not a great afternoon." I paused. "But afraid doesn't stop us. It never really has. We just kind of factor it in and keep going." She wrote that down. I watched her do it. I thought, watching her, that she finally understood something she'd been trying to measure for weeks, something that doesn't show up cleanly in a behavior index or a biometrics readout. Not the healing speed or the adaptation rate, or any of the numbers that had frightened the conclave strategists. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, from the outside, a lot like stubbornness, but from the inside, just felt like ordinary life. I boarded the shuttle. I wrote my final log entry, somewhere over the dark between stars, with Earth a faint light in the viewport ahead. They replaced my blood with something they spent centuries perfecting. In a month, my body improved it. I'm choosing to take that as a compliment. Earth, I'm coming home. Try to act surprised.